Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pied Piper of Pasadena, Part 5. This is the story of Dean Coral. When we last left off, we had talked about how Mary would create the Coral Candy Company right after Jake would take full control of Pecan Prince. And as soon as she would create the Coral Candy Company, she would appoint Dean as vice president and her younger son Stanley as the treasurer. And things were going fairly well for the most part until Jake would be very intimidated by the growing popularity of the Coral Candy Company, and eventually would try sabotaging it by writing letters to various people and places and say that the Coral Candy Company were stealing their recipes from that company. And when Mary found out about this, she would quickly divorce Jake West, and they would begin building their company, building factories and so on. And eventually Dean would get drafted into the army, and eventually Mary would write a letter to the army saying that he was needed at the company. After Dean would return on 22nd Street to the factory to begin working, it is said that Jake West started putting labels on Pecan Prince's candies and did it as a way, as kind of a jab at Mary, by using the label the original Pecan Chewy. And Mary, knowing what Jake was up to, retorted by putting a label on her company by saying new and improved with a woman's touch. And they did like these little back and forth things to kind of up each other up in their company. But it is said by various workers within the factory of the Coral Candy Company that they could often hear Dean and Mary talking about how much they hated Jake West and that they would do anything to put him out of business. Around this time, Dean would actually take full control of the goings on within the factory, and would even go on the factory floor and actually work within the factory. A lot of people would talk about that he was a known prankster, and they really loved his sense of humor. And while he was doing all this and working full-time in the factory, Mary, who was 49, decided to take a step back, and she would mostly spend her days shopping, going to the hair salon, and going on copious amounts of dates. And one thing could be noted about all these dates that she was going on: she would always try to tell Dean about her dates, to which this would actually irritate Dean a whole lot. And I can't really blame him on this one, because I don't think there's any child that wants to hear about their parent going on a date or what happened within that date. It's also said that Dean had a lot of female suitors, and there were few females at the factory that he would often flirt and tease with, but always within an arm's length. One girl in particular would actually invite Dean to the beach to go on a date. And Dean would actually show up to this date in his windowless van with a van full of children. And immediately after Dean had gotten out of the van and the girl had noticed that he had brought all these kids with him, she was immediately furious, and she would storm off, and she would vow to never go on a date with him again. It's also around this time that certain workers within the factory began suspecting that not only was Dean a more or less closet homosexual, but they also had fears that he may have been a P-word, because he would often spend a lot of his times with little children, more so little boys than anything else, and had noticed that he was growingly flirtatious with teenage boys. He would spend most of his time walking within the schools and the streets and handing out more candy to children around the street, and he would even start taking teenage boys on surfing trips to the beach. And this is one main reason why people started suspecting that he was a P-word. And even stranger still, he would begin doing things within the factory that made people kind of question stuff. He would actually install a pool table in the break room of the factory, and there was a shed that he would actually install stereos and fixtures to make it kind of like a teenage hangout spot. And a lot of the teenage boys in the area would actually go into the break room and play pool with Dean, and it has been said that they could see a lot of teenage boys congregating to the shed that Dean had fixed for these teenage boys. It's not really clear when Dean began touching boys or molesting boys, but it is very clear that while having a lot of these teenage boys congregating in the building and playing pool, one particular boy that worked at the factory would not ever be left alone with Dean Corll. And when adults would ask why you don't want to be left alone with him, he would just hang his head down and just get really quiet. So it gives reason to believe that maybe Dean Corll had attempted to do something with this boy, but it hasn't been confirmed or denied. It's around this time that Dean started picking up a very strange habit. As he was having these regular visits with the teenagers at the factory and the shed, he started a habit of, in his word, discarding of defective candies. And most companies, if there's defective food, they would just throw them in bins and it would just be trashed or taken care of properly. But Dean did things in a very strange way. He would begin digging holes behind the factory and would also start pulling the floorboards up of his office. And what he would do is he would place the defective candy in a plastic sheet. And he would take the plastic sheet over to the hole and fill it with cement and bury the holes. And when he ran out of room behind the factory, he would start doing it within his office. And it's another side note I want to add. While he was doing this, he would only do this at night and completely alone. When he ran out of room behind the factory and his office, he would also start doing this at a nearby bayou. And this bayou would eventually be turned into a parking lot. So in 1973, when the authorities have learned about Dean Corll's crimes, surprisingly, they did not exhume the parking lot nor behind the factory or this office. To this day, we have no idea what he was burying in those certain places, but considering the nature of his crimes and considering who Dean Corll is, it's suffice to say that his kill count or body count of people that he had killed in the years that he began killing kids is probably substantially higher than what the estimate that the detectives uncovered. In 1966, Mary would get married a third and final time, this time to a sales merchant that regularly went across seas. And there's not much known about this particular guy. We don't even know what his name is in the information database, but for sake of argument, let's just give him the name Ike. And it is safe to say that Ike and Mary did not have a great relationship. Ike was not only verbally, but also physically abusive and extremely manipulative. And because of how Ike was, Dean would actually refuse to be around his mother, who he was very close with, even refusing to go and see her on her birthday, which would actually hurt Mary a great deal. And Ike did not like Dean as much as Dean liked Ike. And Ike would often go to Mary and suggest that he was supposedly a creep and P-word, just like Jake had said in the past. But Mary would defend her son to a fault and say that there was nothing wrong with her son and he was completely normal. And by 1967, during one of Dean's many trips to Helms Elementary School, there he would find, meet, befriend 12-year-old David Brooks. And this is where our story really gets bad.